Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 2 of the Podcast Digest. The moment is Jericho. So hello again, everybody. Thank you guys very much for joining me again on our second episode here of the Podcast Digest. We've had a great first week. I've been extremely excited about all that we've been able to do so far. The show is now available on iTunes, on Stitcher, inside the iOS applications like Pocket Cast and Overcast and Castro, also available inside TuneIn Radio. So we've really got a lot of great things going on so far. In addition, I've recreated a website. I'm now using thepodcastdigest.info. It's simply a blogger page for now and a new hover domain, the podcastdigest.info. Still going to be working on that website in the future and updating it and improving it as we go along. For our opening section this week, before I get to my 2 new shows that I'm going to be recommending to everyone, if you missed the first episode, you can go back and listen to that, where I recommended the Cell Phone Junkie and the Amish Baby Machine podcasts. I'm going to insert a new segment here that I'm going to be called Listener Tips. And what I'm going to do is just be telling all of you about my last, 7 or 8 years as a podcast listener. Some of the things that I've found have been helpful, have been advantageous, have really improved the listening experience, and I hope they do that for you too. So today I want to tackle kind of a big subject. I could really go on for a very long time about this, but obviously I want to get to the show itself. So I'll just briefly touch on podcast apps. For both iOS and Android, there are a lot of different podcast apps. I imagine most of you are consuming this show right now inside a mobile application. So the first one we need to mention for sure is Apple's podcast app. It's going to be installed by default probably in the next week or two in the upcoming iOS 8 update. It's a perfectly serviceable solution, especially for the newbie, if you will, somebody just introducing themselves to podcasts and trying to figure out if this is a medium they want to start investing some time in. The podcast app from Apple will do that. Once you become more into podcasts and you start putting a lot more time and effort into finding the best shows and listening to those that really interest you, you're going to want to create playlists. You're going to want to start setting up things like sleep timers and start points and skip speeds and how it interacts in your car, and you'll grow out of that application more or less. The application that I use, that I prefer the most, is Pocket Casts. I've mentioned this as well before. I have an iOS tablet, the iPad, of course, as well as the iPhone 5S. But I also have an Android tablet, the LG G Pad. And what's great about Pocket Casts is my progress in listening through all the podcasts that I subscribe to will actually sync between the devices. And I find that extraordinarily helpful. If I have one or a battery dies on another, I can simply pick up the other one, regardless of platform, and I see my progress. So I'm a big fan of Pocket Casts. It doesn't mean there aren't other great solutions out there. Overcast from Marco Arment is getting a lot of attention in the last couple of months. It does some unique things that are worth investigating, things like Smart Speed, which actually take the downtime or the dead air and shorten those so that you get through the podcast quicker. It actually saves you time and may allow you to add another subscription or two, as well as Voice Boost, which actually will level out a lot of the volumes between different people who are on the shows, or what I found was great was between multiple shows. I know listening in my car, sometimes one show will be at one volume, another show will be at another volume. Overcast does a pretty good job at evening that out so that the car speakers don't start blaring because a new episode has started from a really loud podcast. There's also Downcast, which is a big granddaddy of them all in the iOS world. Extreme power user application, all kinds of edits and options and things you can do with playlists, supports video, audio, and just a ton of features. It can be a little complicated for somebody new to the podcast scene. You may use some terminology that you're not completely familiar with yet, but as you become into the genre more, I think Downcast will meet any needs you could possibly come up with. I have used it. I still have it on my phone, and it's a great solution. There's also Castro, which is gorgeous as far as I'm concerned. It's probably the best looking application, but very limited in the power user features. So playlists are very limited, and there's not a whole heck of a lot of control you have of what you're about to be listening to, but a very beautiful application. And of course, Instacast, which used to be one of the powerhouse applications in the iOS world. They did some upgrade things and sort of backed people into having to buy new versions. So I think it's lost a little bit of its following. But I've recently looked at it again, and it is a very quality application with a lot of options, a lot of different things that you can do. So let's begin with our shows, shall we? I have 2 shows this week. Maybe the title has given them away, maybe not. And but I hope that you will learn something here, and I hope that you will tell me what shows you like. I'd love to hear from you on Twitter at PodDigest, or shoot me an email, thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. I'm looking for show recommendations all the time for myself to be introduced to something new. I'll take a listen, and if I'm really enthusiastic about it, I'd love to talk about it here on the Podcast Digest. So our first show this week is The Moment with Brian Koppelman. This is a Grantland podcast. It's part of the ESPN family, but it doesn't really focus on sports. It focuses rather on pop culture. A lot of Hollywood writers, directors, actors are all featured on here. If you go to sports.espn.go.com, search for their podcasts, they'll bring you to their pod center, and you will find The Moment with Brian Koppelman. I've really been impressed with this show. I came across this show because I'm also a listener to Adam Carolla's podcast, several of Adam Carolla's podcasts, but the Adam and Dr. Drew show, which is another great podcast, by the way, they had Brian Koppelman on as a guest about a month and a half ago or so. And I'd not heard of him before, and I really thought he was impressive on that show and the conversations he had with Drew and Adam. So they mentioned that he also had a podcast called The Moment. So I took a look, started downloading a couple of episodes, and this has been an amazing listening experience. Let me tell you a little bit first about Brian Koppelman. It may not be a name that you recognize, but he's from New York City. He's a writer and director. He's also done some of the movies. He's been a writer on movies that you may have heard of, things like Rounders, Solitary Man, Knockaround Guys, Ocean's 13, and The Illusionist. He's been a writer for all of those. Also has done a 30 for 30 documentary with David Levine called This Is What They Want. He's also a part-time actor. He's been in things like Michael Clayton and Premium Rush. You can find him on Twitter at Brian Koppelman, that last name spelled Koppelman. And he's also reached a certain level of recognition for doing the 6-second screenwriting lessons on Vine. Those are just a trip. If you are on Vine at all, check out the 6-second screenwriting lessons with Brian Koppelman. So let's talk about the show. The basic format is an interview show, but the focus of the interview is kind of interesting. He really focuses on the path that a particular successful person took, and when they encountered those moments in time in their history, they faced a decision or challenge, and how they managed those, what they did to work through those, how they improved past those points. But let's not get this, I don't want you to get the wrong impression. This is not necessarily one of those motivational or inspirational centric type shows. That could be an effect that maybe you receive as a listener from listening to The Moment, but it's not really what it's designed for. It is an interview show. It's about an hour long, and there's no advertising, which I think is great, mostly attributed, I'm sure, to its affiliation with Grantland and the ESPN. They have those things sort of covered. I've listened to about 8 to 10 shows, and they've had some awesome guests. Adam Duritz of the Counting Crows was very recently on the show. Mike Birbiglia, he is a stand-up comedian and a regular of This American Life. Doug Allen, creator of The Entourage. There's authors, writers, directors, actors. It's all kinds of successful people from the entertainment world. Brian, as a screenwriter, obviously reaches out to these folks, brings them in. It seems like almost all the shows are done in person, so the production quality is exceptional. Generally family friendly. It doesn't carry the explicit tag because he does actually beep out any language that is used, which I think is cool because I think the show does have really broad appeal. And in terms of its format, again, I called it an interview show, but I may be doing it a slight injustice there. This is really more like a conversation, as Brian has reached out and brought on people from the same industry, if you will, or related industries as himself. It ends up being this really intriguing, interesting back and forth dialogue between two successful people that, for people like me and maybe people like you, you would find it extraordinarily mind-blowing to be sort of the fly on the room as these two people have the conversation about the path that they took. It's really, really interesting and somewhat difficult to describe, to be honest with you. It's something that I think you sort of have to give a shot to and listen to. They get into great stories from the past. If you have any tie or association with any of these folks, for me, Adam Duritz of the Counting Crows, I was a huge Counting Crows fan growing up. So hearing this side of Adam and his past and his struggles and his point of view on how he became, one of the greatest pop singers of the last 20 years in his band was a really interesting tale for me to soak in. So I really encourage you guys to, if nothing else, go to the page I described at the ESPN website, search for their Pod Center, look for The Moment, and check out the list of guests and find one that appeals to you and just give it a shot. Brian's presentation is awesome. He is born to be a podcaster as far as I'm concerned. You'll find it very interesting, very intriguing. And so far, I've not really found something along this line in the podcast world. So for its uniqueness, for its informativeness, for the perspective that's offered by Brian and his guests, my first recommendation this week is The Moment with Brian Koppelman. Follow him on Twitter at Brian Koppelman. Check out his videos on Vine and take a listen to The Moment. So our second show this week is somewhat niche-y. I guess it would appeal more to fans of this particular form of entertainment, but I think it also has a broad range appeal. This show is Talk is Jericho with Chris Jericho. Yes, the wrestler from WWE fame has made a long career in the wrestling ring, but so much more on the show Talk is Jericho that I want to tell you about. First of all, this is a Podcast One production. If you've not heard of Podcast One before, this is a huge network of podcasts. Go to the website podcastone.com and look at all the different shows that are out there. To be honest with you, while I've been a podcast fan for years and years and years, I only found out about maybe a month or two ago, maybe 2 or 3 months ago, about Podcast One. I have no idea why I'd never stumbled across it. But when I went to their website, I found so many celebrities that I have an interest in have a show on Podcast One. And it's worth a look as well. I mean, you can find shows from Stone Cold Steve Austin, Rich Harrison, Adam Carolla, Clark Howard, Dennis Miller. It's a wide range and a really interesting network hosting all kinds of shows that are worth checking out. But back to Talk is Jericho, because I think this one deserves a particular highlight here on the Podcast Digest. Jericho, of course, is from the WWE, so right off the bat, you're going to get a great background. You're going to get great stories from him coming up in the industry. A lot of his guests are wrestling-oriented. There are interviews out there. The most recent one was with Triple H, Dave Bautista, which was a really great interview as his star sort of blew up this summer with the Guardians of the Galaxy movie. Steve Austin, of course, and a lot of wrestlers current and previous. He did a great Mick Foley interview in the past as well. But he also expands that. He is also a huge music fan. In case you don't know that much about Chris Jericho, he also is in a band called Fozzy. He has put out his multiple albums with that band, sometimes has taken time off wrestling to perform with Fozzy. So he gets great musical guests from the Scorpions and Kiss and Def Leppard. But he also expands. He's also a huge movie fan. A couple shows ago, he went on a nice big diatribe about his favorite Quentin Tarantino movies, and I'm a huge Tarantino fan. So he also has guests for like director Eli Roth and William Shatner and Howie Mandel have all been guests on Talk is Jericho. And let me tell you what, Chris Jericho does an amazing interview. He is another one, as I mentioned back in the first show I'm recommending here. He is almost built for podcasts. He's a showman, he's a performer, he's an entertainer, and he's got a great style with how he interviews his guests. He really lets them have the floor and really allows that guest to shine and tell their story. And I highly highly enjoy the banter back and forth he has, especially with the old wrestling guests. Me, I'm 35 years old. I was a big fan of wrestling growing up, and when he's talking to some of the stars of that day or talking about the old stories when he started, it's sort of peeling back the curtain of my childhood, if you will. And maybe you'll find it that way as well if you had any remote interest in wrestling back in that day. Production values are very high in this show, as almost with all the Podcast One shows. I'm sure there's a professional editor and producer that handles all this together. There are ads, and it is somewhat ad heavy on many of the Podcast One shows, promoting their affiliate links and other shows and straight up sponsorships. But on Jericho's show, I found many of them are live reads within the show's current recording, and Jericho just really puts a spin on them. He does great renditions, if you will, of these read-in ads, and he makes even those fairly palpable to somebody who tends to be an ad skipper. Many of us probably hit that forward 20, 30, 40-second button to switch that, and I'll still do that. But when Chris Jericho reads one, at least the first time I've heard it, I usually will listen to it because Chris really does put a spin of things. One recent show that I really wanted to point out, if you have any interest in the show as I'm describing it here, Talk is Jericho, and I hope that you do because it is really worth a listen. One example of the range and flexibility of the show was Chris Jericho did as many other shows did, a Robin Williams tribute several weeks ago when Robin passed. And he brought in Jim Norton, who's another stand-up comedian and was a friend of Robin Williams. And he told some wonderful stories that I hadn't heard on other podcasts. And Chris also put together a awesome selection of audio clips from stand-up and movies, and Chris would come on and talk about each one, and you could really tell that he was a huge fan and like so many others, hugely influenced by Robin and his work. It just was a really well-produced show, and you wouldn't think from a show like Talk is Jericho or for a host like Chris Jericho that one of the best Robin Williams tributes I've heard over the past couple months, and there were a lot being done, came from Chris Jericho in this show. This show comes out twice a week, right around that hour mark, maybe a little bit less. And to be honest with you, given, and Chris will talk about this on the show, that he's still active in wrestling, starting a tour in a couple of weeks with Fozzy, given his insane travel and touring schedule, maybe one of the most impressive parts of the show is that he's able to put it out twice a week. It is an amazing fact. He's always coming from different locations, and his mobile setup is obviously very good. My final thoughts on this show is that I think this show's going to really be bigger and bigger and bigger. Chris has the ability to really transcend the genre he comes from. He's been game show host before. He's been on Dancing with the Stars. He really has broad-based appeal. And as long as he continues to bring in guests from multiple genres and multiple areas of interest, I have a feeling this show will be huge, bigger than it is. It wouldn't be a surprise to me if it was already one of Podcast One's biggest shows, and it's going to be bigger and bigger and bigger. So jump on this bandwagon now. So that's it. That's it for this week. Those are the next two shows on episode 2 of the Podcast Digest, The Moment and Talk is Jericho. Subscribe to them both, guys. I promise you will not be disappointed. And please subscribe to this show if you haven't already. Obviously, I'm just now getting off the ground, only 2 episodes in. I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts, whether it be following and interacting with me on Twitter at PodDigest, or give me an email, thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. If you simply like what I'm doing and hope that this will be a great new place for you to find new shows, an iTunes review would be excellent. Check me out on Stitcher. I'm there as well now, and I'm really looking forward to getting more and more great show recommendations out to you guys, and I hope that you're enjoying. So that'll be it for this week. Don't forget to subscribe and listen wherever you find. Check out the website, thepodcastdigest.info. This is Dan Lizette signing off, and I will talk to you next time.